Welcome to Next Round with me, Gael McDermott.
And me, David W. Higgins.
A young Irish look at the economy, politics and society.
Covering home and abroad.
For the thinkers, the dreamers and the doers, this is Next Round. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Next Round. On this week's episode, with election 2024 finally at an end and the dust has well and truly settled, all eyes turn now towards government formation. So we want to spend some time looking at the possible coalition options and what are some of the issues going to be facing the next government in Ireland. Also, the Residential Tenancies Board is marking 20 years as Ireland's regulator in the property market and the rental market. And they've released new data as well, which we want to explore. And last but certainly not least, tariffs. We want to look at tariffs, with tariffs being announced by the incoming Trump administration in the US as a tool for diplomacy. We want to look at what that might mean and what are some of the implications for tariffs that are being waged in the future. So if you do like this podcast, please like it, please share it, and please subscribe. We're available on all major podcasting platforms, also available on YouTube, where you can watch and subscribe to our podcast there as well. David, it is good to see you. And
See you too.
We want to, first of all, turn to election 2024, which as I mentioned, the dust has settled on it, and all eyes are now moving towards what a future government might look like. I don't think there was really much surprise. I know in the last week with the exit poll, there was a possibility of the government parties being discombobulated, might be a way to phrase it. But actually, the result is pretty certain, with Fianna Fáil getting the most seats, Fine Gael a bit behind them as well, but both combined just shy of the majority of 88 that is required. So all eyes are now looking towards what the next coalition is going to look like, and it seems to be it's moving towards a Fianna Fáil Fine Gael coalition with the support of independents. I know we still have to see as well whether Labour or the Soc Dems are going to really make any sort of play to join that government, but I think the most likely outcome is going to be Fianna Fáil Fine Gael supported by independents. But the real question is, what will, in terms of divvying up jobs and what the balance is going to look like, we've heard the phrase parity of esteem being used over and over again in the last few days. And this is because, Fianna Fáil have the guts of, 10-9 seats ahead of Fine Gael, which shows that there is a bit of a difference. And I'm not sure if you saw in the Irish Times this morning, David, as well, but this is starting to creep into negotiations where there is a question of, will Fianna Fáil have the office of Taoiseach for longer than half of an agreed time frame within the government? And will they have a bit more of a grasp over the direction of the next 5 years?
Yeah, so I think this is where the rubber will meet the road on getting a deal through. There has to be some reflection of that 10-seat gap. The previous rotating Taoiseach was a kind of 2.5-year job where the government formed in the early part of the year. It was the middle of the year. So the election was February. We didn't get a government formed until the summer, June, July. And then the rotation date was at December. So you did 2.5 years and then you did the other half on the other side. But actually, because the election was this side of Christmas, the term that the Fine Gael rotation got on the second half was a bit shorter anyway. So if you have a 5-year term, we're trying to get things formed from Jan into next year, Fianna Fáil might come along and demand a full 3-year run in the Taoiseach's office, which even if you do, let's say you do 3 year and 2 year, that's a 60-40 split. But the mix of the parties is actually 55-45. So you'd end up with a little bit disproportionate bit of time there. But if you end up having an earlier date of the subsequent general election, then you also get a bit squeezed on time towards the second half of it. The other thing then that you can work with is the number of cabinet seats. We're lucky that the cabinet is actually 15 seats, so you end up with one party having more or less anyway. You can never evenly split them. But if you add in independents looking for cabinet seats, then you could end up with a challenge there. So maybe it's 2 independents and then it goes 6 and 7 between the two larger parties. So that's some of the configurations that you could use to make that happen.
Yeah, and you also have you have 15 official cabinet seats, but of course then you also have the super junior, which is the junior minister, the greatest junior minister who gets to sit at the cabinet table but is without a vote. You also have the EU commissioner as well, which the next government will nominate on the latter part of that term. So there are different ways to split it. I do think, though, from a negotiating standpoint, though, David, I can't see Fine Gael agreeing to a 3 to 2 year split on the office of Taoiseach. I think, if you look at the seat difference compared to the voting difference as well, I mean, we're talking a percent here or there between the three largest parties. And
you mean on first preferences? On
first preferences, yeah. And so, I think to concede the party of esteem piece, I just don't know if that is if Fine Gael will go there, because the reality is, what's the other option? Well, the other option is you would it's Fianna Fáil, Sinn Féin, and what, Labour, Soc Dems, maybe. That's probably the other option for coalition. That's already been ruled out So I think realistically, I think the hardline negotiating point will be Taoiseach 50-50, and I think the give will be on the other elements. So again, the ministries and the extra nominations, which the next government will be able to do.
The other thing to consider is the switch between finance and public expenditure, which was also being rotated. So if Paschal Donoghue gets to go back into finance, that and for longer, that is also a bargaining chip that kind of tilts, something to Fine Gael that will actually kind of make coming together a little easier. The challenge here with this is that it's really important that actually both two parties get over these divisions soon before they talk to the independents, because if you're then bringing in the independents when these questions are still up in the air, that then looks quite bad. The risk of the optics actually emerging quite negatively for both parties here could be quite bad. If it's kind of a case of, look, it's jobs for the boys and we can't figure out how to align them, then that just because the people are going to be asking where's actually the policy difference, and that's where bringing in these independents.
Say, David, policy in negotiations.
I know.
That doesn't matter.
Yeah, I like that. That's the optics that can be out there when these things arise. But actually, what will, I think, more likely emerge is there's potential out there for some more substantive policy. So think Independent Ireland, for example. They've been talking about priorities on farming and fishing. And that could well be some policies that chip away at some of what the Greens have been trying to put in place over the past Dáil term.
Yeah,
and that could become a point that you end up stuck on with the main government parties as trying to get through. There is also talk that there will be some disagreement on justice issues between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And that could be where Fianna Fáil make play for that ministry that Fine Gael held for actually Fine Gael have held it consistently since 2011.
They seem to want it as well. I mean, judging by how they advocated in the campaign just gone, they seem to be really hell-bent on wanting the Justice Ministry.
Yeah, and the swap there could be for health, because Stephen Donnelly is gone, and he would have walked straight back into the ministry.
Sure.
The thing about health is if you're a minister that wants health, you'll keep it. I'm thinking of Mary Harney, who, after the '07 election, was able to continue in the role even as an independent,
As an independent, that's right. Yeah.
even though the PDs had broken up, because she had done the work there and there was a willingness just to continue. That can't happen now with Donnelly, so the more natural thing could be it just goes back to Fine Gael. So that could be the sort of swap you do there.
Yeah, and of course the other piece then is around, in terms of split of seats as well at the cabinet table, do the independents actually get it? And that's another question where I just don't know. I think it might be a case of they may not get actual seats. They might get a junior here or there, but I just don't know if they'll actually get the. I think the focus will be way more on policy and what they can extract in a program for government versus sitting at the cabinet table.
Yeah, you can get policies promised through program for government, but there is bigger impetus when you run a ministry and you're the senior minister for it and you're the ones bringing the memos to cabinet. There is a bit
Yeah.
of that, but then the experience question comes in. I mean, if the likes of Sean Canny and Boxer Moran, who were junior ministers before, so they could step up to senior a bit easier, you'd have some. There's probably not a senior ministry going to some of the first time independent TDs. There's Lady Gillian Toole from Meath East and Barry Heenan from Bay North. Even if they roll into support a coalition, they certainly won't be jumping straight to senior cabinet.
I saw former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern. I think it was on a podcast recently. Actually, he was talking about government formation and how stable they can be, and he recalled that I think it was one of his previous governments I think it might have been '97. That was technically a Fianna Fáil minority supported by, and they had about 3 independents supporting it. Went the full term, didn't give away any cabinet seats, and those 3 independents, I think one of which was the Healy Rays, successfully extracted and got their policies implemented in the wider government agreement. So I think the piece around, I think to your point, David, actually, like the piece around who sits in the seats versus what policy gets implemented is actually the more important point, I think.
Yeah, and then of course you have the point of view that a lot of these independents have a constituency priority. It's partly their mandate is to represent their constituencies, and that may not require cabinet seats. And yes, it could be just policy extraction in the background. I think though that things have changed a little bit. I think since that era, that was back. You mentioned the Healy Rays. That was Jackie Healy Ray was able to get various projects for Kerry. Take the likes of Michael Lowry. He's been always very supportive of previous coalitions, even from the opposition benches. But if it's the case that more of optically larger kind of projects start going to North Tip or whatever, I had this joke with a friend that all we need to do now is build a Lewis through Nina, and that's going to get the coalition off the ground. But some of the optics of that are actually quite challenging, where it could quite backfire quite negatively against the government if they're seen to be just bowing down to very particular pork barrel stuff.
Yeah, like Tipperary International Airport might not be a runner, but at the same time, what it might give is an impetus for prioritization of critical infrastructure. So if we think of, let's say, this new Department of Infrastructure, which might be set up, infrastructure projects, which might be in kind of these key constituencies, may get a higher prioritization on the list of countrywide initiatives versus how they might be lower down in should they not be in government, for example. So, and
some you're right, and some of that is kind of down to ministerial decision, and that could be just through meetings with independents. It could, yeah.
But of course, all of this in the face, David. Those are their jobs, but the next government has big challenges facing it for the next 5 years. People mentioned, we saw during the campaign this whole idea of voting for change. I think that people did not actually vote for change. They voted for stability, and I think they liked more or less what they saw the last 5 years and want to see a repeat of it. And with that, of course, is a focus on housing, a focus on justice and immigration, of course, and I'll be curious to see as well how climate moves forward in the face of the Queen's no longer being part of a government.
Yeah, I mean, like Ireland will be on the road to various fines under various kind of
Yeah.
climate obligations that are out there. And a point I saw that was kind of quite fairly made by an observer was that where the Greens used to have to be the justification for those policies in the last coalition, now Fianna Fáil Fine Gael will have to stand over climate policy a bit more visually themselves and actually take some of the more flack directly. The other issue that is going to come up is going to be, and we're going to talk about this later, but trade and tariffs and potentially having to get quite tactical and respond to that. That's going to be on the agenda of the government as well, and whoever we have in foreign affairs and in finance is going to play a key role in that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, well, I think a busy week or so in the last week, and a busy period of time ahead. We probably won't have a government before Christmas, but I do think I think that, and I saw the language from Micheál Martin as well. I think that the intent is there to kind of get this up and running and agreed pretty swiftly, and I think by January, hopefully, we'll have a new government decided and moving forward, which I think we all want, versus a dragged out process for months and months and months. So let's shift gears. David, and the Residential Tenancies Board has recently marked its 20th anniversary as the regulator of Ireland's rental market. And they've released new data. And David, do you want to run through that?
Yeah, so I actually went to an event with the RTB celebrating their 20 years. I mean, maybe just to give a kind of quick history, renting in Ireland used to be something that was less common and for a shorter period of time. So people used to be able to get a home to buy sooner as they progressed through their younger working lives.
And is
But
that private renting? Yeah.
Yes, your private renting used to be a smaller
Yeah.
part of your life, and then getting a home to buy came sooner. But as house prices notched up in the 1990s, people rented for longer because it was harder to get a home. And the need for something like a more regulated sector came along. You end up with the RTB, and that's why that organisation is marking 20 years. But the RTB, they have a decent amount of data that they now track on the number of private landlords, for example, and they track the rents that are, set within those agreements. But the interesting thing about the RTB is that I think it's in a way an incomplete picture of the rental market. So the RTB have a metric that shows that there's about 240,000 or so private landlords in Ireland. But then you have the census that was done 2 years ago, and it shows over 300,000, about 330. So there's a gap in the middle that could be about 100,000 or so people, or sorry, not people, but households that are renting privately from a landlord, but they're not in the RTB.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a mix within that. So there is a chunk, they think, of kind of between 10 and 20,000 of people who really should be registering their tenancies that aren't currently registering them. But then there's a great chunk in the middle of rental agreements that are quite informal, that can often be between family members. So you could have a family that had an investment apartment or something, and they rent it out to their son or daughter during college, and then that continues for 10 years because you're not going to leave a cheap rent place, and you bring friends in and out of the place and that sort of thing. So there's the RTB. When we think of the RTB, you got to think of that being the kind of the formal rental market, and there is like an informal market that's out there as well.
Okay. And I know, Dave. So I mean, they released some data as well, and they had a report, which showed. I'll just run through some elements here. So let's say national rent increases. So for Q1 of 2024, the standardized average rent for new tenancies rose by 8.1% year on year to just over 1,600 per month. Existing tenancies saw a 5.9% increase, and the difference between Dublin versus outside of Dublin, new tenancy rents in Dublin increased 6.3%, versus areas outside of Dublin basically double, 12.2% increase. So we're seeing that move from quite urban Dublin to outside. Rent pressure zones, RPZs or Zs. We saw the Carrigaline local electoral area in Cork and the administrative area for Galway County. They met the criteria for being defined as a rent pressure zone, having recorded 4 consecutive quarters of new tenancy rent inflation above 7%. So a bit of a mixed picture there, David, but I think really seeing the move and the impact of rent and that pressure outside of Dublin.
Yeah, so this is a trend that's kind of been humming along for a while now. Dublin has much higher rents to begin with, so it's hard for high rents to go significantly higher, and there is that bit of a catch up that you could call it for areas outside. But it's also down to the fact that Dublin has had a bigger set of building going on. New apartment blocks tend to get built first in the Greater Dublin area, and then the other cities are a bit underloved and forgotten about. And by the time developers go on and try and get a project going, we're just behind on time. So that's partly why you also see Dublin's rents not going up as much, is there's more new supply available there. The rent pressure zones are an interesting one. It's amazing when you get talking to people at these conferences. Like the rules for rent pressure zones are a 2% annual increase in rent. That's one part of the cap, but the other is looking at CPI inflation, and it's whatever the monthly CPI is at a given time. So because the level of CPI is actually now below 2%, if you were a landlord, you go to increase your rent now, you'd actually be capped at something like 1.5 or even a bit lower.
Yeah.
But the other quirk to the RPZs is that if you have not increased your rent in 2 or 3 years, you're able to do a cumulative rent increase in one go. So some landlords, they go 2 or 3 years without increasing their rent, and then even if they're under an RPZ, they're able to do it by 4, 5, 6% in 1 year. But then they'd be limited for 2% in subsequent years. So that's partly why you see some increases that are above 2% within the data.
Which is interesting because in the report it showed, so from Q2 2022 until Q1 of this year, it showed that 60% of properties saw no rent increase during that period of time. So that speaks to your point about the cumulative amounts. And David, I'm just curious, sentiment is always a interesting thing to reflect on as well. In the report, there is some good news. It says over 8.4% increase in registered private tenancies. So, and also the number of private landlords in the country is up 5.7% annually as well. So we're seeing signs of, both more rental agreements happening and more landlords entering the market. Was there a sense of optimism from the discussions?
So this is where I go back to this definition of the formal market and the informal market. When the RTB says that they have an increase in tenancies and landlords, that's landlords or tenancies that are registered. It's very hard to know. And this is the big skepticism that comes up when you go to these conferences. Everyone's skeptical of whether that number is a true reflection of what's actually happening. Because if you talk to some estate agents, and there's estate agents at this conference, they're saying, well, there's more landlords getting out of the market than there are coming in. So what you're more likely seeing in those numbers is a kind of a greater formalization of the market, that people are getting out of the informal and going informal. Why would people do that? You now have this renters tax credit, which was again increased at the budget. So suddenly tenants, to get to avail of that, it has to be an RTB registered tenancy. So suddenly you would want to be registered for that. There is more clampdown coming from the RTB on the unregistered sector. They're sending out letters. They're working with county councils in particular. There's a lot of, they found a kind of a proportionally higher unregistered rate, they believe, in some of the kind of rural northwestern kind of border counties. So they've sent out letters via the county councils to people there. So there's a few balls that are in the air that are actually moving from the unregistered to registered. But actually, if you look at my hunch is, if you were to look at the overall private rental sector, it's probably flat or shrinking a bit, because there's still a lot of landlords that are selling their properties. That's a counterpointed a little bit by the new build, by new apartments and all of that. But I'd say on the round, the number is still tilting downwards.
Okay. And then what about the piece, and let's say, the increase, the sizable increase um, in new tenancies in Dublin versus the rest of the country? We're seeing lots of activity, especially the border counties as well. Like Donegal, Leitrim and Longford showing double-digit growth rates in rents for existing tenancies, over 12% being the average. Was there any commentary on the Dublin versus non-Dublin, if I'm to use that phrase?
And sorry, is that 12%? That's the number of tenancies, or the actual rent level that's being paid?
That's the growth rates in average rents for existing tenancies. So I think the question there is basically, was there an overall sentiment and difference in terms of how the rental market is playing in Dublin versus outside of Dublin?
Yeah, well, the big thing that comes up is the idea of making all of Ireland one big rent pressure zone, because outside of the RPZ areas, the RPZs cover not just Dublin, but the other cities, a lot of other large towns, and even some rural areas. But then there's more rural and smaller town, village kind of areas that don't have RPC coverage at all. And there is talks of, well, you should just cover the whole thing. That was in the manifestos of some of the smaller parties. It would just give consistency coverage across the board. And there have, yes, been larger increases. So even if you've gone 2-3 years without increasing rent, not only can you increase it by that cumulative 4, 5, 6%, you could do 10 or 15 or 20% if you wanted outside of an RPZ. And you could also have tenants leave and then increase it by 20, 30% if that's where the difference lies. Whereas under a rent pressure zone, if you're putting the place back out in the market again within 2 years, you have to honor the capped increase under the RPZ.
Okay. Well, it's it's an issue which it'd be interesting to see how the new government plays with it as well and deals with it, because there's been good progress made on housing over especially in the last 2 years or so. So it'd be interesting to see how that policy changes.
Yeah, and just the final point I'd make on that is so the RTB are looking at private rentals.
Yeah,
that's all within the private rental market, as I was talking about the census. But there's another sector which is social housing, and social housing is like historically been done by county councils. But you have this sector of social housing called the approved housing bodies, and that is where somebody who's come off of a housing list will rent from an approved housing body at an agreed affordable social rent. So it'll be at a kind of a much lower level than the market. Those tenancies have to be registered with the RTB. So their metric of approved housing body tenancies is a good idea of where social housing tenancies are going, although there's more to it than that. You go back about 2 years ago, there was about 41,000 of such tenancies. It's now nearly just under 50,000, but 49 something. That has been a steady increase quarter on quarter. And I shared this out on Twitter saying that look, part of the reason we had an election that was low key, wasn't as much controversy around housing as there was before, is that there has been a chipping away at the problem in the background. We won't be calling this issue solved for some time, but a lot of people who were on housing waiting lists over the past couple of years have quietly had a phone call from an approved housing body or some other agency to say, look, we've got a place for you. It's at an affordable rent. It's going to be something that your income will be able to you'll be able to thread water and actually afford the place. And that kind of chipping away at the problem shows in those numbers that was also released yesterday. And I think that's worth noting too.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's turn, David, to tariffs. And this is in light, of course, of President-elect Trump's recent decision to, or announcement at least, to wage tariffs on key trading partners. So we saw, for example, President Trump announced that he wanted to have a 25% tariff on all imports from Mexico and Canada. And this is aimed at addressing issues related to illegal immigration and drug trafficking. Also included in that announcement was a 10% tariff on imports from China, which was intended to curb fentanyl production and other concerns as well.
Sorry, just to jump in though. Is the fentanyl? Did you say fentanyl from China, or did you mean from Mexico? Because the fentanyl comes over the border to Mexico, is it?
Yeah, but he added, but so in addition to Mexico and Canada, he also announced it for China because that's where the source of it ultimately comes from as well. So
Oh, is it ultimately coming from there? Okay,
yeah,
okay. I didn't know that.
yeah.
I'm not up to speed on my drug supply chains. That's just
No, well, you better get up to it, Higgins, because this is this is a key issue, which and I think the first point is, first of all, is in his policy announcement. I mean, the fact that he has contained China in with Mexico and Canada, of which they share a trade agreement, I think is it goes to show you the reality that we're all facing now. But focusing first of all on tariffs, because I think what we want to do, David, is just talk about, what this would mean. I mean, tariff, of course, it's taxing imports, and this will lead to potentially, if implemented, higher costs for US companies that rely on foreign goods. So, for example, of course, take if you were to take vehicles, which of course there's lots of cross-border on vehicles, 25% tariff on a vehicle would of course lead to significantly higher prices and raising the cost quite significantly. He, of course, President Trump, he's used trade deficits as the spur for countries that he wants to target on tariffs. Now, he has previously hit countries that have had trade deficits with the US on tariffs. The data has shown, of course, that has not had the desired effect for him. In fact, it's had a limited impact on that. And just to kind of cover just some key points on the effects that tariffs have had on the previous administration. I mean, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York found that tariffs during Trump's first term decreased stock values upon announcement, and they were linked to lower future earnings, sales, and employment levels for those firms that were affected. But what he's doing here, though, is that while it can affect, if implemented, it has a negative effect. But I think what he's doing here, David, is he's using it as a threat and as a stick to get the changes that he wants. We saw, for example, take Canada, 25% being announced on imports from Canada. Well, what did that do? Prime Minister Justin Trudeau flew down to Mar-a-Lago in Florida and had dinner with President Trump to assure him that the border was going to be looked at and there would be changes coming from Canada on that. So, while yes, we know that if these tariffs are implemented, it has a negative effect on the policy announcer, in realpolitik terms, he actually is getting what he wants.
Yeah, and he may, if he fully gets his way, bring Canada under as the 31st state. His
51st state.
51st state, excuse me. Yeah. So look, that and I think you're right on that front. That this is all about politics. It's about trying to get Canada and Mexico to bend his way, because the supply chains that are there in North America, whilst you might look at Mexico and say, okay, that's led to jobs going over that border and it's all lower wage stuff, and that's a kind of hit to American jobs. That probably isn't Trump's focus in talking about tariffs there. Certainly it isn't the case with Canada. He's not looking to lead to permanent kind of friction of those trade flows. There's very little to be gained from that. It is about extracting something political. It is on the side of China, though, that it is very much about trying to impose a kind of a harder stop on future trade with China. Any further erosion of jobs going overseas, particularly as far away as it is to China. Trump sees that the risk, I'm sure that many countries now do, of having your supply chain so far away and to regimes that you don't have strong alignment with. I mean, Trump wouldn't get along with the Trudeau government or the more left governments in Mexico, but he sees them broader in the democratic space, and with the kind of broader Western umbrella over them. He doesn't see that with China, and he sees the risks there, and he wants that decoupling. The question, though, is how he steers that decoupling whilst also being the president elected off the back of cost of living and inflation pressures. He needs to make sure that he doesn't impose tariffs so strong and such a strong decoupling that it just surges higher the price that ordinary Americans pay for a whole range of goods and services.
Yeah. Well, of course, if you look back to the US tariffs on steel and aluminium in 2018, the Trump administration imposed tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminium, citing national security concerns at the time. And the economic impact of that was, of course, increased costs for US manufacturers who were reliant on those metals, such as those in the automotive sectors, those in the construction sectors, which led to inflation, increased costs, and ultimately facing higher production costs, and therefore being passed on to consumers. So these if implemented, and I was doing some research on this, David, as well. There's been numerous examples where countries that have gone down the tariff route to support their domestic markets have just had the exact opposite effect and increased prices on consumers. Corn laws, of course, in Britain, we've mentioned this before on the podcast. That led to increase in elevated food prices for the British public. We saw as well the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act around the time of the Great Depression in the US that raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to record levels. The result of that was a sharp decline in international trade, and it's widely believed to have deepened and prolonged the Great Depression. And then there's been other examples as well. So if it actually gets to the point of it being implemented, it will have that negative effect. But I think it's more of a case of, at least with Canada and Mexico, trying to get that political concession from them. China, though, it's different. You're right.
Yeah, and the block we haven't talked about within this is Europe. Where does Europe sit within this? And I know there's been a bit of tariff setting between Europe and China in recent times, and if one does it, the other has to kind of retaliate and notch it higher. I'm curious to see then, would there be stuff direct from the US towards Europe? I haven't seen as much talk around that at all. But Ireland could well find itself caught in the eye of some storm. It may not be a full hit to all our industries. I mean, it's worth recapping. If you're in something like tech or finance, that's services. It's not physical goods. So the risk of tariffs being applied directly to those sectors, and for the new Trump administration to kind of, for that to be a problem, I think is a lower risk. Something like pharmaceuticals, microchips, that kind of thing is a little more risky, but those are supply chains that the US are very conscious that they need to keep flowing. They are.
Yeah, and of course then you have, because he always looks at the trade surplus. Is there a trade surplus, and therefore how do you bring this more into equilibrium? And of course Ireland wouldn't do well out of that. Nor would many other countries in Europe. But in the UK, where the trade deficit isn't as significant, that is being cited as a reason in recent commentary, David, for any tariffs to actually not be waged on the UK, and actually the UK may benefit in in an environment next year where tariffs and trade wars are well enforced.
Oh, so that could be tariffs. Yeah, tariffs get applied in and out of the EU bloc, but not in the UK.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. So because that trade deficit isn't as significant when compared to, I mean, certainly Ireland, for example. I mean, it's quite clear that there is a trade deficit.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's an interesting one.
yeah, like yeah, that will be interesting because, like, I guess the EU. I'm just thinking of the EU Brexit relationship, right? I mean, the last thing any of those two want to do is tweak that by having any sort of tit for tat on the rates being applied. I mean, Britain has huge trade volumes with the EU, and they've only just come through those negotiations. So hey, they don't touch them. But yeah, if you end up with higher friction between the EU bloc and elsewhere, that may lead to the UK being seen as a less frictionless market to deal in and out of.
Exactly. Yeah. And I saw as well, Nigel Farage has offered his services to be the conduit and the voice of reason between the incoming Trump administration and the Starmer government here in the UK as well, where he wants to again be that bridge between transatlantic relations on both sides. I thought that was he was on Question Time last night, actually, David, and I think he vocalized that again, that he's willing to serve if
Yeah,
required.
well, that's an honest answer if ever I've heard one.
I know it's interesting times, David, but I think all of this is in the context of, we have a new US government coming in. How will Ireland be viewed in that new administration? I think time will tell. But we know, Ireland's economic situation and policy will be in the lens of this new administration, and it'll be just very interesting to see, what policy plays they make and what decisions they make, and if that, if Ireland's economic policy position will be significantly challenged under Trump administration. Time will tell.
Time will tell, indeed.
Okay. With that, we are out of time. So again, thanks everyone for listening and watching. If you did like this podcast, please like it, please share it, and please subscribe to it. We are available on all major podcasting platforms, also available on YouTube, where you can watch us there and also subscribe. Until next time, next week, we'll see you then. Thanks again for watching, and take care.